Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our second episode of the Saywa podcast. Today, I want to explore with Christine a little bit a question that she has on her mind, and maybe that's a question that many of you share about how do actually psychotherapy and spirituality meet? Is there a connection? And if there is one, what does the connection look like? So this is something that she has been exploring in her private life and in her own practice. And maybe she can give us a little bit of an idea why she's passionate about that right now.
Yeah, I am really passionate about it because, if you look at the internet and you look at the web and you see all of these teachers, they're out there and they're speaking, and you're starting to see psychological constructs like narcissism, for example, seeping into the language of spiritual teachers. They're starting to talk about these psychological constructs. And at the same time, you sort of see psychology starting to like touch into spirituality and meditation. And it seems like these two giant I don't know, realms of thought or inquiry are starting to meet in places. And I'm curious about where one starts and where the other one starts and where they both end. And is there a healthy place where they meet? And how do you discern that? How do you know?
Oh, this is a very complex topic. It's a topic for the
Yeah,
times that we're living in right now. No? It's the merging of different realities.
yeah,
It's the merging of different approaches to achieve union and to come to a higher understanding, of course, right? And it depends what is your venue of approach. Is your venue of approach, was it originally spiritual already? Or was your venue of approach, for example, in the field of psychiatry, pathology, psychotherapy, and so on? And then, of course, the direction and the access point is a bit different. I think what many people in the spiritual field, what they may lack sometimes is conceptually more specific descriptions of particular life circumstances, where psychotherapy offers a lot of more, let's say, concepts that give you a way of structuring your own thoughts, of understanding and labeling certain types of phenomena that might have not been described, especially relationship wise in spirituality, where the concepts there do not really exist much. Because the focus, of course, in spirituality is on achieving God communion, right? And to achieve God communion, the focus is not on the little me. And therefore, these intricate details that people are yearning for, especially when it comes to intimate relationships and family matters and so on, there they might turn a little bit to psychology and then draw some concepts from there and try to integrate that into their spiritual understanding. And for those who come from a field of psychotherapy, for example, maybe they have worked in that area, or people who have gotten counseling and so on, might reach a point where they realize, oh, therapy is not enough. There's something more, there's something deeper. And I needed to kind of make sense of this little picture that I'm working with all the time, with those conceptual details about relationships. Like, how do my relationships fit into the greater whole? Right? And there is a union there. There's a potential fusion there. However, what I will say very directly is that spiritual practice is superior. And the reason I will say this is simply because it also depends on the type of therapy that we're speaking about. For example, if we
mhm,
speak about therapies that are currently widely in use, like cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's focused very much on the idea that consciousness is generated by the brain, but it isn't. And any meditator who has basically stepped out and watched his own ego operate, how can you be in the brain when you're watching what the brain does? So
mhm.
when we start stepping out of the brain, we realize, okay, I can try to fix this. I can try to obsess over this little I, and try to make it a better little I. Or I can step out entirely, which is a much bigger leap, or you could call it a quantum jump of consciousness, to say, I cease to be identified with this and I step out entirely. But very few human beings can do that. It
Yeah.
takes a deep level of practice to be able to do that. And this is why I guess there's a fusion, there's a merging of a slower transition of an ego psychology to a spiritual psychology. And I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense. Although what I struggle with sometimes when I think about this is that our bodies, our brains have a profound impact on our experience. I mean, definitionally, it seems to me that this is our interface into this reality. And we need a certain level of deconditioning or health or something in order to have enough of a toehold to be able to do spiritual practices sometimes. It seems to me there's some threshold of, I want to say sanity or health or body awareness or something to let you take that next step. And how do you, so I don't know, what do you think about that, those ideas?
Well, I think you have a point. And I had to learn this the hard way because my approach in some ways is very traditional, right? And my mindset is very Asian. And Asians don't complain much. Yeah.
Right.
When you, for example, deal with Indians, when you deal with Chinese, when you deal with Japanese people, you don't need to explain to them that spirituality is something worthwhile doing. And you don't need to explain to them that you need to sit a certain amount of hours, that you need to do certain exercises. But the Western mind is wired very, very differently. And interestingly, the meeting of East and West happened already earlier in the beginning of the last century. So if you think about Carl Gustav Jung, for example, yeah, and C.G. Jung was going also to India, to many different cultures and exploring different spiritualities because he thought when he got in touch with the sort of type of Indian spirituality that the Westerner couldn't deal with it. The Westerner needed something else, needed some different access points. So he developed his depth psychology or what he called analytical psychology, right? Where he started exploring the subconscious or the unconscious rather. But the unconscious is actually an access point to the spirit realm where, let's say, the waking ego cannot control the so-called content from the unconscious, where it starts spilling into the waking mind. Either for example, it happens in a dream state, where the ego kind
Mhm.
of goes to sleep, and then you get messages through the dream state. But if somebody is more open, it happens through visions and so on. So there might be a point where you say, oh, we have so much conditioning. First of all, indoctrination in the system, trauma that was transmitted from our grandparents to our parents, then to us, where actually our guidance system is scrambled and our intuition is actually not spiritually active, or it's so suppressed and dissociated that maybe therapy could be a good approach to first do some deconditioning, so to speak, to then be open to sitting in meditation, for example, because what I've seen in many people is that they have so much anxiety accumulated, they're constantly in fight or flight, that if you tell them to immediately do Zen practice, they snap, they just can't do it. They
Yeah.
end the practice immediately. So they might need something with movement first. They might need more shadow expression first, that these build up energies that they express creatively through, let's say, art, through dance, through sport, through, right? Activities so
Yeah.
they can release that energy somewhat because they're having a constant inner pressure cooker because they have the ego on top, they have the soul that is suppressed, they have the soul trying to penetrate through the ego, break the ego apart. So there's a constant inner tension that they exist in. And you can tell that by they move all the time. They can't sit still. Yeah, when
Yeah.
I have someone like this in a counseling session, they're sitting in front of me and they have a lot of micro movement. I know they have tremendous stored up anxiety and karma. And then sometimes it might help because the mind is afraid, of course, no? Of spiritual practices. So it
Yeah.
might help to have partially a psychological approach to just give them the explanations to make the mind ease up so they become slowly ready for something that goes deeper. But everybody has their own pace. And to figure that pace out, that has to do with compassion and experience. And of course, a great sense of intuition to know what somebody needs.
Yeah. As you're talking, I find myself asking the question, I mean, what actually is the ego? Sometimes I wonder if the ego is just the physical, genetic body consciousness that is survival consciousness. And essentially, there's this interesting fusion of higher self, Buddha mind awareness with this genetic body consciousness. And essentially, the entire spiritual path is just working to heal or overcome the body consciousness. What do you think of that?
Well, the ego is not the body consciousness.
Okay.
The reason you're saying this, because this is how most people experience it, ego.
Yeah.
Because they worry about, can this thing survive? Can I feed it? Can I pay my rent next month?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Does it have health issues? So these are body thoughts, right? And this is placing identity in the body. But humans also place identity in the mind. I remember there was somebody who I talked to in the psychiatry once, and he had actually diagnosed as narcissistic personality disorder. And his biggest fear was that his mind stops, because he was totally identified with his intellect. So ego is identification with sense objects. But that can be psychological objects, that can be spiritual objects, it can be any sort of object of experience from which you draw a narrative, a story from. And then it becomes a limitation. So in a more advanced way, or let's compare beginners and more advanced practitioners. So a beginner, for example, might have certain attachments. Let's say they are in a romantic relationship and they want their, for example, girlfriend, boyfriend to replace God for them. So you be my God, my father, mother that were imperfect. You be perfect for me now. So I feel whole. So I feel I have arrived. So I feel comfortable. And then this fight or flight response will try to control the relationship, the resource of comfort, right? Okay, this is very basic, instinctual human level. This is very low in consciousness. But let's now speak about a yogi. What about if a yogi goes into meditation and he remembers hundreds of past lives? What's his temptation? His temptation is to create identity from the past lives and to build his ego up this way. Oh, I'm also experienced. I'm this and this important person. And then it leads to a cognitive dissonance with the current reality where you cannot interact with it consciously anymore because pride has built up. So suddenly reality is not enough. So you will see that these type of ego traps exist on every level. It's just that the average human being identifies with the animal characteristics more and then identifies with the mind. And a more advanced practitioner needs to be careful when they make powerful mystical experiences. Let's say there's a tantric in India and he's praying to a deity. Let's say that deity manifests clear as day in front of the practitioner. Then the practitioner needs, after that experience, to settle his nervous system again, because it can become a high. You need to understand that.
Yeah.
So you see that temptation exists on every level, and temptation is identification. Drawing identity from your experience, because then you're suddenly in the story and not in the reality of experience.
Okay, so then what is the difference between identification or de-identifying and dissociating? Like completely,
That's a
yeah,
good one. And I've heard this question a lot, yeah? Because those who, for example, go to psychotherapy and because of trauma, they have issues of dissociation. Yeah. They ask themselves, like, well, what's the difference between dissociation and detachment? Because it kind of sounds the same, but it actually isn't. Dissociation requires an agent of suppression. For example, not to be willing to feel, not to be willing to see, not to be willing to know. But detachment is seeing, feeling, knowing without suppressing it. Total acceptance. And through total acceptance, detachment happens as a spiritual phenomenon. But you're fully aware of what is going on. There's no suppression of any sensation.
so then the work becomes getting to that agent of suppression.
Yes. But that means first, and this is where you spoke about the idea of body consciousness. Huh?
Yeah.
People associate their ego with their body, right? So first of
Yeah.
all, it's very interesting because people who are in the ego, they're actually not living in the body. They're living in the mind. Yeah. So for a lot of people, before they even can begin meditation, because understand that meditation, again, it doesn't make you peaceful, it makes you aware. And the ego is afraid of being aware, right?
Yeah.
Not that itself could be aware, but it is afraid of you entering awareness. What that you is, we're not going to describe for now. But say the ego is nervous that you become aware, because if you become aware, the ego is not boss in the house anymore. It's kind of like the servants, no? They put their feet up on the table, they made a mess in the house, and the master comes home and turns on the light, right? Then the ego
Yeah.
is terrified. Oh no, the master's home, I can't dominate anymore. So for most people who are very body identified and mind identified, they're actually not in the sensations of the body. They're not in feeling. So when they sit somewhere in the garden on the grass, they're actually not feeling the grass. They're not feeling the sunshine on their face. They're not conscious of their breath. They're constantly in the mind prison and listening to these train of thoughts, and they jump on these train of thoughts and they get lost. And that's dissociation, where you get lost on compulsive thinking and you lose body connection. Because if you're actually aware of what your body feels and your breathing and your sensations, smelling, yeah, tasting, touch, if you're aware of that and breath, what happens actually, more of your soul is present in the body. And that's when the ego starts panicking, because the ego can only exist when you dissociate. When you consciously live in the body, your soul will begin pushing out the narrative.
So is basically the more ego driven that we are, basically the more dissociated we are,
That's correct.
essentially.
Yes. So one of my spiritual teachers one time, and I will start sharing more of these type of anecdotes. I just need to be a little bit careful.
Yeah.
So one of my spiritual teachers, and this might be hard to believe for people, but I can see them. And one time I was taking a walk on a graveyard, and I saw him like as a holographic manifestation, and he was telepathically speaking to me. And at the time, I was going through some sort of grieving process, because I started figuring out that a lot of mediums and mystics at the time, when, let's say, lockdown started and a certain injection became popular and so on, that they start channeling wrong information. And there were people among that I actually enjoyed listening to before, but then I went through a situation and understand it was just the beginning of the lockdowns. It was like years later with all the studies coming out and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, but intuitively, I knew that what was happening was evil. I could feel it. And I saw these people that I previously like enjoyed and admired to some degree, suddenly channeling the evil agenda and saying it's okay and so on and so on. And then I walked with one of my teachers who used to be a bit of a rebel in the past. And he said to me, Julian, love sees everything. A master must see everything. And that's the opposite of dissociation. When you're willing to see the darkest of the dark, that's when you are in the light. Because light illuminates. But if you perceive the darkness as normal and just part of your daily gig, it's Tuesday, I'm sitting in the cubicle, everybody's getting, right? That's just normal. When you're in that, you perceive, when you're in the darkness, you cannot see the darkness. You can only see the darkness when you're in the light. That means once awareness enters, the awareness will make you conscious of the dark. And this is what the ego is afraid of, and that's why it wants to dissociate. It doesn't want you to become conscious of the dark, because the ego is the dark. And then once you figure out the ego is not you, you will go on a quest. You will be like a crusader knight trying to find the Holy Grail. You will try to get rid of this thing. And it knows. So it has to keep you under a spell of collective conditioning, of family conditioning. It needs to keep you under the spell of karma. So it wants you to dissociate, because if you dissociate, there's no light in the body. It's kind of like the light bulb is switched off. But if the light bulb is switched off, you don't see what's in the body. You don't see what's in the psychology. It's kind of like being in a dark room and you don't know where the objects are. So it is important to understand that the proper spiritual pathway is to avoid nothing and to see everything and to know everything. And then to not wobble when you do. Be in full acceptance also of the terror, yeah, of the
Yeah.
horrific things that people do to each other, the
Yeah.
existence of
Yeah.
death, illness, and so on.
Yeah. I have noticed during hard times in my practice when a tremendous amount of terror would arise. And I've always interpreted that as ego not wanting to die. And at the same time, it's so very real. And
It's,
finding the technique of sitting
it's
in
not real.
that,
Not,
right? It
not
feels
trying to
right, right, right.
interrupt you, but I need to be
No,
clear here. It's not real. Okay, but keep on going.
so for people that are in this place where, like, let's take the example of the people that were teaching and channeling, and you could see that they'd fallen off the path. So from their perspective, they might be feeling incredibly embodied. They may not see it at all. So how do you catch yourself? What's the hint that you're not in truth?
That's a very challenging one,
Yeah,
especially for, let's say, a mystic. Let's say you have a medium who is 95% correct. They get used to being correct.
yeah.
So they just, on some level, start assuming that they're always correct. So they don't feel these little impulses anymore from their shadow. Because obviously, in order to channel distorted information, for example, there needs to be an aspect of me that I am in denial of, and this aspect needs to be replaced by a dark energy. But because of dissociation in that soul aspect, I will not notice that it is dark energy operating. And this is why practitioners, even of a certain level, need gurus. That's a truth that the Westerner does not like to accept.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have my own teachers who keep me in check, and they're
Yeah.
not pulling
So
punches. Yeah.
so go ahead.
So what I'm saying is that it is tempting to think that we have arrived. And I think what happens with some of these mediums, they have done the work for so long. And then what I know, because I investigated that, then they had, for example, past life issues when in the Atlantean times, where the transhumanism came up, and they started modifying themselves genetically and started using certain technology. That a lot of these mediums who are channeling now that transhumanism is okay, they actually lived back then and channeled the same thing. So they're repeating. And they are repeating, and that's what we always need to know when we have a subconscious fear of something. So, for example, if I have a fear of being disowned by my family, if I speak about a certain inconvenient truth, or if I feel I will not be popular as a mystic anymore, and this might not be even a conscious thought that I'm observing, this might be a subconscious thought that then is only sensed as an impulse. Yeah? So the difficulty is that these beings have not completed their shadow work, but they don't fully know or fully understand that they haven't. And it is because there is a difference between an enlightened master and a mystic or an adept of a certain level. And this is, and even enlightened masters are still learning. Because the universe is constantly creative, is constantly reinventing itself, right? But it is the ego's trick of making you think you have arrived.
So if you never find yourself questioning anything that comes into your experience, or if you find yourself never ever in doubt, is that a signal that
Yeah.
perhaps there's a piece there?
Yeah. Because, well, for example, I remember Shunryo Suzuki, the Zen master, he was writing in his book, a father who thinks that he's a good father might not be a good father, and a father who thinks he's a bad father might actually be a good father. So doubt is a difficult matter because doubt can also be of an evil nature. Doubt can be, for example, if a mystical practitioner is in deep meditation on God and he's about to reach a certain threshold, and dark forces are feeding him telepathic thoughts that make his ego denser. And then he needs to breach through that barrier. So that can be very dangerous to fall into the idea of doubt. But on the other hand, if there's no questioning of one's own understanding, yeah, then there is a chance of making lapse in judgment, where the discernment goes down the drain. So discernment is key. And through the proper discernment, actually, we arrive at faith. But it's something organic that develops over time, because through proper discernment, when you find, for example, what you have experienced in spiritual practice, you see the evidence of that through your practice and through the experience that you're having, then confidence builds up in the practice. And that can be very beneficial because your concentration gets stronger. Yeah, your dedication to the practice gets stronger. But there are always tests on certain initiation levels. So a proper practitioner needs to have constant vigilance. And it is not the same as being in fight or flight. I want to make this very clear. It's just being aware. You constantly investigate your own emotions, your own motivations, and you do it meditating up on God and asking for that proper assistance. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the dark side is clever, intensely clever. And usually the dark side is smarter than every human being alive. That's why without divine support, that discernment cannot build.
So this is why it's important to have that connection with the divine in prayer. I mean, you've got this Western idea of sort of, well, American certainly, of rugged individualism. I'll do it on my own. I don't need anybody. I don't need a teacher. I can build my own connection to something. But it feels like there is this resistance. I've seen this resistance in myself and others to developing a relationship with a guru or with, divinity.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? And that's a tough one because in the 60s and 70s, when those connections were made, you had the Beatles going to India, you had also Osho coming over to America, right? You had all these stories.
Yeah.
And there was a huge amount of fake gurus at the time who started exploiting that the Westerners didn't know anything. Like they couldn't fool the Indians, because the Indians, of course, they see that every day. They have a certain degree of discernment, who's a trickster, who isn't. And even Yogananda, in his autobiography of a yogi, he said very, very clearly that in India there are many frauds, even at his time, right? And it's just that the Indian attitude is, oh, let's support gurus, because if he's a real one and we don't support him, that's horrible. If we screw up, okay. Right? And I get his attitude. But the challenge is that when you are a practitioner of a certain level, that, I mean, we spoke about this a little bit in the previous podcast about the discernment, how to recognize a proper teacher, and that the majority of people actually are not capable of recognizing that. Right? And right now we're dealing with a Western collective mind that is very traumatized from centuries of dictatorship through the church. Right? And the difficulty about this is that the church tried to have a monopoly on spirituality and destroy every other pathway. So, for example, in the European traditions, of course, there were shamanic traditions. There were many like intuitive women who had the sight, so to speak, right? So there were many traditions that dealt with mediumship, that dealt with spirits in nature, that dealt with a certain form of healing or prophecy. right? And the church started exterminating all of that and replaced it with monotheism. Ultimately, it's actually not a conflict. No? You can have the one God expressing himself as many different deities. In the same way, we have many incarnations. So it's not a contradiction. But when you are, let's say, in one party and you want to kill the other party, they don't investigate it on that deep level. So because then the individual spirituality was under massive assault, people then later, especially in Europe, and this is maybe for Americans who are not particular, or let's say, who don't have connection with that particular part of history, around the beginning of the French Revolution, there were a lot of great philosophers coming up, especially German philosophers. And they started emphasizing the sovereignty of the individual. And there was a big movement away from the church in Europe, not only because of what the church did, but because of what the aristocracy did. Because the aristocracy said, I am king because God has ordained me as king. God has chosen me as king. I have divine ruling right. So in order to disconnect religion from power, it was very, very necessary to say, no, the individual is sovereign. Yeah. So then all these philosophers created, let's say, a new age of enlightenment, and then science started replacing religion. Now we understand what happened in the last few years. Because people started then, instead of going into spiritual practice and praying, they went into submitting to the scientific dogma, which the dark elite then used, because they had blind faith in that. So we see we should never have blind faith in anything. We need to investigate. But the point is that suddenly the intellect was made the bastion of the ego, because it protected you from church. It protected you from false spirituality, protected you from dogma. That is what the belief was. But it did tremendous damage to spirituality as a whole. The issue was church, not spirituality. And now we are in an opposite movement where everybody, I gotta be careful here, but let's say where a huge amount of people go into a new spiritual narcissism because they believe sovereignty is sovereignty of their intellect and their ego, and they are failing in their spiritual practice because surrender doesn't happen, devotion doesn't happen, bhakti doesn't happen. And any proper tantric practitioner, and for those who are listening, tantra has very little, if at all, anything to do with sex. All right? Tantra is in general a word for the Eastern type of occultism. Let's leave it at that. So any tantric practitioner that wants to elevate himself through certain yogic practices, tantric practices, what they build is a relationship with a deity for protection, for guidance, because we at some point touch realms that are so beyond human psychology that beings who exist in this realm, they always get the drop on us. Because we don't understand the physics that they operate in, but they do. So without divine protection and divine guidance, these things cannot be safely explored, they cannot be known. And Westerners don't want to do these practices, because it's an attack on their sovereignty. That's what they believe. But what they're actually protecting is their own narcissism, the idea of specialists, the idea of being superior. And I have met plenty of Westerners who came to me for teaching, and they pretended to be humble. They pretended to be listening, but then secretly they would do their own thing. They would do their own experiments. And because of what I can see and know, I see when there's a practitioner and darkness is closing in on them. I can see the entities that are in their rooms, that are communicating with them. And then they come to me and they say, hey, I just talked yesterday to my spirit guide. And I was like, oh, okay, that's what you believe. But I saw them being surrounded by demonic entities and receiving telepathic communication. And those entities have knowledge. They have a great deal of mystical knowledge. So they will give you maybe 90% that is correct. And then you feel confident and empowered. And then when it comes to enlightenment and realization of God, they give you the 5% information that is wrong, so you'll never get there.
Mm.
Yeah. So the Western ego is in great trouble, Because on the one hand, sovereignty of the individual would be a good thing if it's sovereignty of the soul, but they make it into sovereignty of the ego. They turn it into narcissism. The ego isn't real. Your soul is sovereign. But the difficulty is that when beings are in the beginner stage of practice, they cannot really discern between their ego and their soul. Yeah, it's a give and get. Sometimes the soul comes through, sometimes the ego takes over, and they do not see when it happens, when the transition happens. And that's why they need to do very basic practice, very basic Buddhist practice or mindfulness practice or breathing meditation practice to constantly be vigilant and watch the mind. And when that vigilance ends because you think you have arrived, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Because we're dealing with a vast universe that is incomprehensible on some levels.
Right. And so I look at, as you talk, I think to myself, the fact that anybody, any higher self reaches escape velocity from this trap is remarkable. I mean, it just sounds, it sounds like it's like threading the most fine needle.
Yeah. The illusion is so sophisticated. And this is why the Westerner, with his intellectual and academic approach, is very vulnerable to demonic forces. Because intellect is what the dark side can deal with all the time. Easy for them. They can give you interesting thought, interesting ideas, and it's very compelling. But faith, the dark side cannot penetrate. And that is why...
Go ahead.
So that is why, for example, when you see saints, they're very simple. They need nothing. They want nothing. Because they want nothing and they need nothing and they fear nothing because their focus is completely concentrated on God, they are invulnerable to demonic manipulation. But you Westerners are very complex. You want a lot of things. You need a lot of things. You're attached to a lot of things. A simple, humble life, the life of a saint, who walks in sandals instead of shoes, yeah, who has one robe that he wears all day, who meditates on God every 3 minutes. That's not attractive. That's not entertaining. That's not interesting. And the need for spiritual practice to be attractive and entertaining creates that demonic vulnerability.
Got it. So then the question that comes to my mind is, so you're describing the pitfalls that the Western psychology or mind encounters. So where's the Eastern mind's vulnerability?
Good question.
Because there must be, otherwise the whole Eastern mind would be, everybody be enlightened, right?
Yeah, and you have a very fair point, because when Yeshua was in Palestine, there's a lot of years that are not documented, and he went to India and was sitting with the Indian masters, not because he had to really learn from them, but he had to remember who he is and activate and download his own abilities in the presence of those who would trigger that in him by being in his vicinity. So he went to the Himalayas, he met great yogis, and then he came back to Palestine because his goal was to fuse East and West spiritually. Yeah, that was part of his mission. So maybe the difficulty for the Easterner, let me feel into that for a second. Maybe the Easterner sometimes doesn't question enough. Yeah. So in the West, we have an overemphasis on individuality, and sometimes in the East, we have lowered individuality. So in terms of discipline and simply applying and getting to it, the Easterner a lot of times is superior in the mindset because they're humble enough to do it. But where they sometimes might fail is in discernment, because they're not stepping up when they need to step up, and they're not being loud when they need to be loud. For the Westerner, that's easy, but it's easy for them for the wrong reasons. So there needs to be a little bit of discernment for the Asian, and there needs to be a little bit of surrender of the idea of being very important as a person for the Westerner. the person is indeed not very important at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for the Easterner, question more, ask more. But don't lose your ability to apply. And the Westerner needs to learn to apply and start to cultivate faith, but not like blind faith, not dogmatic faith. Have faith in spiritual practice until spiritual practice presents you evidence that that faith is warranted. And then faith turns into knowing. When you know, you don't need faith, you don't need belief, because you know how the physics of this works. So when you know, belief is a placeholder. Many Christians don't accept that. They just say, "Oh, I believe in Jesus, and I'm out of here, and I have the get out of prison free card." No, you got to deal with your karma.
Yeah.
You got to deal with it. You got to work on it. But Christians don't want to know that. But I got to be careful. There are some great Christian mystics out there, right?
Yeah.
But it's important to know that blind belief doesn't get you anywhere. And if we are developing faith, it shows through the practice, through the simplicity, the discipline, the repetition of practice. And that creates a strong mystic. Yeah. And that's why I sometimes suggest for the Westerner, instead of thinking of it in terms of faith, replace the idea of faith with discipline and apply discipline instead and see where it leads you. Because if you're disciplined in your practice, at some point, something's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this idea of blind faith and doing the practice because somebody says to do the practice. And in the beginning, when you're learning, I don't know, for instance, martial arts or something, you learn the technique, the tool, you do the tool, you do the tool, you do it, do it, do it. And there is some idea of blind faith that that's going to lead somewhere. So I think, doesn't blind faith have some kind of a role, at least in the beginning of the spiritual process?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the sad, let's say the side effect of it, even though ultimately nothing is sad, because ultimately everything is a learning experience, but subjectively sad on a human level, is of course that blind faith can be manipulated and misused by someone who is in some sort of authority or power position.
Yeah.
It always needs to be considered. But let's speak about that blind faith. So if somebody, for example, practices martial arts, let's say someone goes to the boxing gym and they learn how to throw a cross, straight right punch. They just learn that, right? So if they have very little doubt and they throw this punch 1,000 times, they're gonna come to an understanding of how the physics of the punch worked, yeah, the bioenergy and so on, how that works, and they will feel something about structure and power transference. Because if you throw a punch to a heavy bag 1,000 times, at some point you get a feedback feeling through the impact and you understand how you punch correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody who's too intellectual, who has not much experience with like physical activity, with sports, they will ask the coach every 5 minutes, am I doing this correctly? Should I not do it like this? Isn't it better this way? And they're super slow learners, super slow. Yeah. So in the beginning, for example, of practicing Zazen, Shinkantaza, just breathing meditation, if you're that type of practitioner, you question everything at every corner, you're constantly sabotaging your own advancement. Because understanding comes through application, not through analysis. But we have been trained to believe that analysis is a real thing, that analysis is like the conceptual barrier that your mind has that actually leads to real understanding. No, it doesn't. Feeling, experiencing, direct knowing leads to understanding. Because you have more faculties of understanding. Emotion is a faculty of understanding. Feeling is a faculty of understanding. Body sensations are a faculty of understanding. And at some point for yogi, other senses open up. There are other faculties of understanding. But in order to get there, and here is the challenge, spiritual practice is something that needs longevity to be effective. So, for example, if somebody works in the field of academics or they learn a certain job, it takes a certain time to learn that job. And then you understand it. But the spiritual science are so much deeper and more complex than anything that you can do as a human being in anything in your life. So when you start getting into spiritual sciences and you begin your meditation practice, but now you're doubting the practice at every turn. Am I doing it right? Should I switch method? And you do 100 methods and you do nothing right, nothing correct, because you're constantly switching methods and teachers. You cannot arrive. And the difficulty is now for spirituality to take proper effect, you might have to meditate your whole life. But most people will quit after 2 weeks. So how can anything happen for them? And then, of course, they feel that their doubt is fueled because, oh, I did this thing, nothing happened. Yeah, for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. You know, some of us have been meditating for hundreds of years. And we remember how we begin. Right? So the type of staying power that spirituality requires is not comparable to any other discipline that you could try to master. And that is why when you apply that psychology from your experience with other stuff, you will not succeed, because the type of stamina that you need in spiritual practice is an entirely different stamina. And that is why without devotion for God, it cannot be done, because it's otherwise too difficult. If you don't have love for God, you don't have the discipline and the motivation. It will not happen. And this is why I feel for the Westerner. They're very stuck.
Okay, Julian. So I want to push on this analogy, and you can tell me if the analogy falls apart as I push on it. But we're talking about people who are starting out in the practice, and if they're constantly doubting and they're going to different teachers and different practices and they never accomplish anything. So we've got this martial artist, they're learning that right cross punch, and they're doing it again and again and again without doubt. But at some point, doubt does need to come in. In other words, discernment needs to come in. So in that analogy, when does doubt show up there? And is there an analogy in terms of the spiritual journey?
I would question the source of doubt. I think that's very important. Find out what is the source of the doubt first. Is the source of the doubt because you want to be more compassionate, because you want to be more wise, because you want to do karmically the right thing by adhering to the law? Or do you have doubt because you want to quit? Do you have doubt because you want to run away? Do you have doubt because your ego is actually being put in a corner by the practice, and you want your I don't know, your potato chips on the couch, and you want to watch porn, and you just want to like let loose, right? You got to figure out what is the source of the doubt. And in an advanced practitioner, the only doubt that arises is, am I acting from law? And in the egoic practitioner, who's at the beginning, it's like, should I invest my time in this? Is my time not better spent with something else? Should I not chase ladies or guys on Tinder? Should I not like video game 5 hours? Should I not, you know, there's a different type of doubt. Yeah? Or should I not focus on making money?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the doubt of a beginner is a different doubt. It's the ego does not want to give ground to God. And the
So I'm
advanced
hearing this
practitioner
idea.
doubts because he wants God to extend through him and take over. That's the difference.
So I'm hearing that doubt essentially is for the beginner, doubt is a tool that maybe shouldn't be deployed yet until discernment is developed. And
They
as
need to have a certain
discernment
level.
develops, yeah, but early on, there might be a need to just say, okay, learn the thing, do the thing again and again and again. And at some point, discernment arises and you start having more nuance in your practice, maybe.
Yeah, practice can later get very complex. Maybe doubt, the word doubt has a certain energy.
Yeah.
Why not replace it to question for understanding?
Ah.
But understanding needs to become embodiment, and we'll go there in a minute.
Yeah.
So the difficulty is that doubt is usually the quitter in us. right? And for beginners, for spirituality to have effect, it takes a few years of constant meditation. It takes like 2 or 3 years before you notice a significant difference in how you perceive, right? But if you doubt it at every turn and you switch methods, it's kind of like you dip your toe into many ponds of water, but you never go swimming. This pond
Yeah.
is too cold. Or I think this water is too murky. Or I think, or I don't like this teacher or what he said. And then they are not at the point where they can actually discern proper teachers. So the key needs to be not to have blind faith, but to apply a method and then have a general trust in the method and apply the method by not entertaining doubt. And then through applying the method, your nervous system will change. The way you perceive certain things will change. Yeah. How your body feels will change. You might notice an arising of an awareness beyond the body. And then through direct experience, through the spiritual process, through the modification that the spiritual practice does on the body, there will be embodiment. But most people never experience that embodiment because they think this practice must somehow benefit their mind in some way. But their mind is solely in the way. It prevents spiritual practice from actually occurring. So they need to drop their minds and have trust in the practice and do hundreds of repetitions. And then through the repetition, access to experience slowly arises. And then that experience becomes verifiable phenomena. And then slowly the mind will begin ceasing its doubt a little bit because suddenly something's happening. But if you always stop before something's happening,
Right.
yeah, and that's what the majority of people are doing. And they are in their practice utterly ineffective. So doubt should have to do with ethics. So for example, a teacher might ask himself, is my action towards that student ethical or not? Is that the wisest I can do? Is that the most compassionate I can do?
Yeah.
Or maybe do I have something in myself that is in the way? Do I have maybe some sort of distortion and I could see my student in a better way? Let me sit down with my teachers in meditation. Let's have a talk and let's have supervision. And if it's really, really urgent, ask a deity. If it's really severe. And then through communicating with beings of a higher dimension, a higher understanding starts manifesting in the mind, because the mind will be realized through the telepathic communication with higher level beings that their logic and their understanding of law is superior to the ego's understanding. And then the ego piece by piece surrenders to the higher understanding. And we constantly need to struggle for that higher understanding. And struggle is okay in practice. Suffering is okay in practice. Sometimes to be uncertain is okay in practice. But we need to seek true understanding. And true understanding is not theory. It's not books. It's not reading about meditation. It has to do with sitting every single day. And what the majority of people do not understand, if you cannot meditate on your breath, if you cannot step out of the ego mind just by meditating on your breath or doing very basic yoga, the later yoga practices become impossible because in the yogic terms, this is chitta. Chitta is the spiritual stamina, the concentration. And when chitta is not developed, higher forms of spiritual practice are not possible to do, because if you're already doubting in the earlier stages, you become very unstable. So when the higher practice are supposed to come, they need a more intense form of focus. They cannot be pulled off. So all these people who are like, oh, basics are boring. I don't want to do them, or they do them a little bit, and then they immediately jump to advanced yogas, read metaphysical books,
Yeah.
occultic books. There's recently somebody who commented on my Facebook. I was recommending books, right? And I said Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now, Shunryu Suzuki, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And, so on. And then he wrote, these are very, very basic books. No, he said literally, these are extremely basic books, which tells me that he hasn't mastered this practice. He just went on because it got boring.
Yeah.
Because if he would have mastered these practices, he wouldn't have called them extremely basic. He would have called them extremely essential.
Yeah. I'm thinking back on my own, years and years of engagement with the spiritual journey, essentially. And um, like looking at Tibetan Buddhism, there's this concept of doing the preliminaries. And the preliminaries are 100,000 of this mantra and 100,000 of that mantra, and on and on and on. And how many times I've been like bored now, and I would switch over to the next thing. And and I remember so many times being on the outside looking in at this practice going, I don't need this. What's the point? Of course. And what I wasn't doing was engaging in it long enough to see the effects of it. So I was falling prey to that constant doubt. Anyway, it's just amusing for me to look back on it now because I have a lot of compassion for that self because I didn't know any other way to do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
See, that's a wonderful understanding. And that's why this conversation is very valuable. Because again, we're trying to bridge a gap here between beginners and advanced practitioners. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and, and you had like the beginner experience, you have a little bit of the intermediate experience, and you see a transition. Yes.
Yeah.
So and for many Westerners, why should I chant pointless words? They're not pointless. Um, Sanskrit is a very powerful language vibrationally. Yeah. And I do know that Tibetans chant certain mantras in their own language, but they also chant a lot of things in Sanskrit.
Yes. Mhm.
And without saying too much, mantras are cosmic phone numbers. So a lot of mantras start, for example, with Om. Yeah, no, for example, Om Ham Hanumate Namaha. Yeah, Om points to zero, source. Hanumate, Hanuman. So it's like a phone number. We start at the zero and then we go to the specifics. We say source, aspect of source, Hanuman, glory to thee. The deities can hear the mantras through the ether. This is not futile. However, depending on your karma, you might have to chant for a very long time. Right?
Mhm.
So I give another example. For example, Yogananda's teacher, Sri Yukteswar, when he died, he later came back. He got resurrected and he manifested in front of Yogananda and he told him about the heavenly realms and what's going on there and what's the process and so on. And he said when a yogi gets enlightened and he enters the higher realm, God will appear to him as what he believed in. So, for example, if the yogi prayed to the divine mother Kali, God will appear to him as Kali. If he prayed to Krishna, he will appear to him as Krishna. If he prayed to Jesus, he will appear to him as Jesus. So the point is that in the mind of God, there are certain addresses that we can address our prayers to, send our prayers to. And for a
Yeah.
Hindu, that's wonderful. They have a lot of choice. Christians a bit more limited. But the point is that God exists in all the saints, all the enlightened masters, all the deities. And then God can take a form, a personalized form. And depending on from what tradition you're coming from, this personalized interface is connected to a certain mantra. Now, if you get past your skeptical Western mind and drop, let's say, the pride in the intellect,
Yeah.
then there is a possibility of experiencing something. Yeah, these things are very real. When I went to Nepal, for example, there's a Kali temple, and I meditated in front of her statue. And I never to this day have experienced something like this. Her whole energy entered my body, took my body over.
Hmm.
Energy started moving to certain energy centers and opening things up and activating. And even though I'm used to experiencing telepathy, meditation, I've never heard a voice so loud and so clear. And I cannot say the specifics of what she said, because that's, in this case, for me
Yeah.
only. But it's important to understand that these phenomena, that the Westerner has doubt in them, because in the Western tradition, there is very little direct experience with it, except for certain Christian saints. Like, for example, there was a saint in Germany, and Yogananda
Hmm.
actually met her. Her name was Therese Neumann. She didn't need to eat. Yeah, and she would go through the Passion of Christ, like on certain dates, where
Yeah.
she would like develop stigmata, and she would go through the crucifixion, having visions and everything. Very powerful experience. But like we have those experiences in the West, but in the East, they just happen so much more frequent that the general trust that people have in the possibility of that occurring is just greater. There's a greater acceptance of miracles. While we have in the West a great skepticism, a certain type of nihilism, if you want to, a
Mm.
cynicism around all of that. Yeah, which then makes the possibility of something occurring small. Because if you think that experiencing a deity is a danger to your sovereignty and to your individuality, of course you're going to block it.
Yeah.
And also, why should the deity bother? It's literally a waste of time. Why should they have to prove to you anything? They don't have to, and they won't. Because their patience is beyond belief. Some of these beings are billions of years old. And they've seen everything that humanity has to offer. They only move in very rare cases when something out of the ordinary happens. Like, for example, the awakening of Ramakrishna in India. When he said to Kali, if you don't appear to me, I'm going to grab this sword that is hanging on the wall in the temple, and I'm going to throw myself onto it. I've been praying to you for years. If you don't show up now, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to end myself.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm not suggesting suicide to anybody, but it's a metaphor for devotion and yearning for God, and that is Shakti. And Ramakrishna's yearning was so intense that the goddess came down from the heavens and manifested. Because existence could not ignore his prayer. It was too sincere. But most people are not sincere in their prayer. That's why nothing happens. In fact, they're angry at God and at the deities and the masters. Because they're like, why are you not giving me what I want? Because what you want is not what you need. Hmm?
Yeah. And so the Western mind, we're all collectively born into this collective karma
Yes.
of this kind of a mind, right?
Mhm.
And of course, this is coming from somewhere. This is coming from our own past life conditioning, which caused us to be born into this collective karma. Um, but you read a lot about we're sort of on a humanity's on an awakening path, that we're having a great awakening right now. Um, so there's hope, right? I mean that we're starting to maybe possibly step out of this
Mhm.
as a race, or as a um, I don't know. I'm just sort of playing with the idea of karma can feel so relentless, especially when it's group karma or civilizational karma,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
And people can't
And
even
yet,
read it. They don't have access to the actual information. Why is it happening this way?
yeah,
Only a few practitioners have actually access to that information. So the information that is behind the manifestation of your experience can seem so inaccessible and
yeah,
so complex that it's totally overwhelming to the individual, right? That's why it takes years of yogic training to be able to actually perceive that information and to make sense of that information. Right? And the question is that everybody speaks about a great awakening. Well, what type of awakening will it be? And that's a choice that you all must make. Yeah. Because if I hear hope, I tell you what I hear. I hear lack of discipline. I hear externalization of liberation. I hear
yeah,
there must be some outside event that pulls me out of the shit.
yeah.
How has that attitude helped humanity over the eons? It hasn't. So the truth is really that we need to get there by our own strength, by our own grit, through our own practice, through waking up in the morning, through going through our yogas, through our meditations, through our prayers, doing our shadow work, and we must do the inner work. And the idea of hope means that the ego has a hope it can escape responsibility. But you are a part of the creator. You're part of God. You're co-creating here. You cannot escape your own creations. So the idea that you can use hope to bypass, and this is exactly what hope is being used for. Every time there's a new political leader, people have hope. Why? So they can avoid personal responsibility. Let's delegate my
Mm.
sovereignty to the system and to the elite and the people in power so I don't have to do shit. Hope in this way is a poison. If you have hope that when you do spiritual practice, that you will get somewhere at some point, no matter how long it takes.
That's faith, not
Huh?
hope. Isn't that faith and not hope?
Better. Well, faith and hope, okay, you could say it's interconnected in this way, right? But I feel hope has to do with an idea of powerlessness.
Yeah.
And I said something very, very intense at the beginning of the so-called pandemic. And I said, because people had hope that the lockdowns would end, hope that certain things would change, hope that the system would release control. And I said the Jews going into the trains to Auschwitz had hope. Stop having hope. Be sovereign. Be responsible. Because if we have hope, we're constantly delegating our own creative ability that creates this reality to something external of us. And then we have to reap the karma of that. That's not intelligent. Rather have the hope that if you do spiritual practice, that God will, in a way, happen in your practice in ways your mind might currently not understand, but that God will, in a subtle way, guide you to the proper laws, to the proper divine laws through the practice. That there will be a revealing of divine law. Therefore, you will act from divine law, and you will cease to act as a separate mind, but actually act as a divine mind. And therefore, you will transmute your karma. You will become lighter in terms of physics. And it doesn't matter what age this is. Everybody's like, oh, there's the new age.
Yeah, the Aquarian age.
So what? There's always another age. But Buddha nature is always the same. And Buddha nature is accessible in every age. It might be more difficult in certain ages. Certain ages are more beneficial for spiritual practice. Spiritual practice will now become easier because of the change in energy. However, if people don't have discipline, when you have more energy, you can also cause more trouble. So then the question is, what type of awakening will it be? Will it be an awakening of delegation to external forces? Or to say, God save me, so I don't have to do anything? So I don't have to grow in wisdom, in maturity, and in the ability to co-create? Yeah, hope is a lazy man's excuse. We don't need hope if we find the evidence of our practice and it actually changes reality. Hope is for those who don't come into knowing or don't want to come into knowing, want to stay children. But the only way out is to realize you are part of God and to start embodying that. And at some point to act as God, act as an extension of God by surrendering the ego and let God take charge of your life. Which then, of course, in more modern terms, is the higher self taking over the system. Merging with the human. Purging ego from the mind. Burning up the ego with angelic fire. Yeah. So, hope is a waste of time. Be present
Better
now.
to do. Be present now and do.
Yeah, and take charge of your life. You are the creator of your reality. Nobody else is, not the politicians, not God, even though God gives you the ability to do so. But you are in charge here. Nobody else, and all this externalization is not happening. Yeah, Master Suzuki used to say, in order for God to know how to create, God must remember who he is through meditation. I can't give a more clearer hint, and I won't.
Oh, beautiful. So we're coming up on time. Any final thoughts? Anything else that should be spoken in this?
I think the thoughts over the last 5 minutes is exactly the last final thoughts that needed to be spoken.
Wonderful.
And therefore, I would say it's a beautiful point to wrap it up for today.
Okay. Well, thank you, Julian. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations.
And I thank you again, Christine, very much for your lovely questions. Yeah. And for helping me to bridge the gap.
100%. And also, let me just mention that you do beautiful one-on-one work with people. And if they go to your website, you can find that kind of an opportunity. And also many teachings on YouTube and Facebook too. Yeah.
Well, the thing that I can do for people, even though I feel a little bit ambivalent about that sometimes, is I read people's karma. I can see why they are in the situation that they're in right now and why their life happens that way and what they need to do to change. However, what what the difference is between a spiritual teacher and a medium is offering you a service so you can receive information. But the information that I will give somebody is so they can change, not so they can keep coming back for medium information and get high on the idea of channeling, because this is not the solution.
Yeah.
But anybody who seeks assistance in facilitating their spiritual process, or maybe you're just starting out and you feel a little bit intimidated by the huge amount of information that is out there, and you want to distill it down to a few things that you can actually do to be effective in your practice, I'm readily available. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, thank everybody for listening, for joining in today. Thank you, Christine, for co-hosting. I really enjoyed myself. And see each other in the next episode.